Bom dia a todos e a todas.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jaime Batista. I'm the president of LIS-ATA, the International Center, Lisbon International Center for Water, and I will start this special preparatory session for Brazil Water Week.
Faço notar que esta sessão tem transmissão em português.
We have live stream going on in Portuguese, English, and Spanish, and the links to watch this session in the other languages are available in the chat box. This is a special session for the Brazil Water Week, which, as you know, is a major event which will take place from May 23rd to May 27th through an exclusive and interactive platform. The website for you to register to participate in this event is also available in the chat box.
A sua tela que está aparecendo é a tela com os dois slides, não está aparecendo a tela cheia, sabe?
We cannot see your full screen, Jaime.
Assim está melhor, não?
Agora ok.
Is it better now? Okay, now it's working.
Temos, portanto, a possibilidade de todos participarem gratuitamente nas sessões
You
especiais.
can join us in our special preparatory sessions that are going to take place on the 27th, on the 17th rather, the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th. You can join us for free, and these sessions will be also streamed through the ABIS channel. There will also be a special session tomorrow on epidemiological vigilance based on sewage treatment. And you can also join us for these events as well. You just need to register. Regarding today's sessions, we are going to organize our session the following way. Now we are going to be talking about the main key points. Then we will have the participation of Cynthia Vilarinho, who will be paying attention to every question that is being written in the chat box. And afterwards, she will be asking these questions to our speakers. Afterwards, we will have a presentation by Rita Amaral, who will be talking about, who will be giving us an overview on the regulations in Latin America. Her presentation will last 20 minutes, and afterwards we will have three very important presentations. The first one by Oscar Pintos, the president of Aderasa in Argentina, and he will be presenting for 15 minutes, and he will be building on Rita's presentation. We will also have a presentation by Julio Aguilera, who is an IDB consultant from Colombia, and we will finally have a presentation by Irene Altafin, who will be representing the National Water Agency in Brazil. At the end, we will have some time for questions, and that's why I would love to have you ask your questions and comments using the chat box. We know that regulation today is an essential instrument for us to implement a good public policy in the country and for us to effectively provide good services, good water and wastewater services. Over the past few years, we have created a growing number of regulations throughout the world, especially in Latin America. Brazil currently has more than 80 regulatory agencies. Actually, we have exactly 84, given the growth over the past few years. In most cases, and that happens not only in Latin America, there is a great potential for improvements. There's a lot of room for improvement through a better regulatory model, better governance and performance, because these are structures that are still being implemented and are not mature enough. The objective of this session is to talk about the current situation of regulations in Latin America, and we'll determine what has worked and what hasn't worked, and also identify trends and challenges. And we want to also talk about the evolution of regulations as a whole. So today we will be talking about the main outcomes of the Regula's LAC program, which is a program created to improve public policies and the regulation of water and wastewater services in Latin America and the Caribbean. This program has been a strategic collaboration involving the Inter-American Development Bank, the Lisbon International Center for Water, and the Regulatory Association of Water and Wastewater Services in the Americas, with the support of the Portuguese government. This program has the participation of 32 regulatory agencies in this country and also has a participation of 15 other countries. And since 2020, we have been carrying out an assessment and benchmarking between regulators, strategic reflections, and we have been discussing some priority themes. Our objective is to have the participation of different regulators, and in November this year, we will have the end of this program. The participants of this program had to answer the following questions: how to assess a regulator of water and wastewater services. What has worked well? What hasn't worked well? What are the different regulation models in the region? What is the difference between regulations in urban areas and rural areas? What is the difference between public and private operators? What are the challenges, regulatory challenges and trends? And what should a regulatory agency look like in the future? Now I will just briefly introduce the members of our panel today, starting with Rita Amaral, who has a PhD in civil engineering and also certification in administration, in public administration. She is also an advisor to the board at Liz Water. She was also a youth delegate of Portugal to the high-level week of the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly. She was also a technical secretariat of Portugal at the 8th World Water Forum. She was also an assistant professor of sanitary engineering, the civil engineering course at Instituto Superior Técnico. We also have joining us Oscar Pinter, who is the president of Aderasa. He is president of a regulatory service in Argentina. He is also a president of an association for regulatory agencies in Argentina, and he's also president of Aderasa, which is the Association of Regulatory Entities for Water and Wastewater Services in the Americas as well. We will also have the participation of Julio Aguilera, who is an IDB consultant. He has a degree in public administration and political science. He also has a master in economics and in regulation of public services. He was head of a technical office and director of the Water and Basic Sanitation Regulator in Colombia. He has also been involved in the Compass program to improve the governance of service operators. We'll also have Irene Altafin, representing the Water and Sanitation Agency from Brazil. She has over 30 years of experience. She's a superintendent of services in the National Water Agency, and she has a lot of experience in the implementation of federal policies, system management, regulation of systems, and she has also a lot of experience working with different financing agents. And once again, I would like to greet all of you and thank you for your participation, and make sure that all participants can share their comments and questions in the chat box so that we can have a very fruitful event and a very fruitful debate at the end of this session. Now I will immediately pass the floor to Rita Amaral, who is going to be making a presentation, an overview on the Latin America regulation. Rita, the floor is yours. Thank you, Jaime. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased and honored to be here with all of you today to talk about such a relevant topic in this sector. And I also want to talk to you today a little bit about Latin American regulations, give you an overview and talk about the challenges and opportunities that we see in this sector. First thing we have to do is to ask ourselves, how can we assess the regulators of water and wastewater services? What do we need to take into consideration? First of all, we need to look at the role of regulators when it comes to the governance of the sector. We can say that there are three major governance pillars. The first one has to do with public policies, which involves the governments defining strategies for water and wastewater services. The second pillar is regulation. Regulation is the driver, a catalyst force that is going to leverage the implementation of this public policy. And the third pillar is service management by concessionaires and operators, which are responsible for making these public policies operational. So regulators play a crucial role helping balance public policies created by the government and also the operators which are implementing these policies. So how can we assess regulators? What crucial elements need to be taken into consideration when we are assessing and evaluating regulators? Well, there are three major points here. The first one is regulatory governance. That is the way things are structured and organized. And here we are talking about aspects such as mission, mandate, skills, competence, scope, mechanisms of independence and accountability, the way the organization is organized internally, so how its process and teams are organized and structured, and resources that are available to these regulators for them to implement and play their role. The second level has to do with regulatory performance. So the way the regulator will be able to implement their functions. And here we have another important set of features. The regulator plays a role in structuring the sector and the regulation of the sector, and it can not only help the regulation of the service, but also help increase the capacity of the different service providers. It is also responsible for regulating the behavior of service providers at different levels. Here we are talking about the regulation at the legal level and the contract level, but we also have economic regulation, the regulation of service quality, regulation of drinking water quality in some cases, the regulation of the interface with users as well. We also have a set of other important aspects that are cross-bordering factors. So here we are talking about the environmental regulations, some specific factors regarding decentralized systems and informal systems and the regulation of these systems. We also have aspects regarding social regulation and also competition regulation. And the third level has to do with the performance not only of the regulator, but the impacts they have on the sector. So once we know what we want to assess and evaluate, we need to think about where we are and what the next steps are. And as Jaime mentioned, here we need to talk about the RegWAS program. The RegWAS program was created for public policies and also the regulation of water and wastewater services in Latin America and the Caribbean. This program has included governments, regulators, international organizations, and experts in an effort to cooperate and create joint actions as well. And it had the participation of the IDB, List Water, and also the Portuguese government. It involves many different. It's a program that involves many different regulators, and we have been focusing on 4 major levels, such as assessment, benchmarking across regulators, and also the development of a roadmap. And I will be talking about the results of these assessments and benchmarking. There were also some different actions and strategic discussions as well, and a capacity building program with the objective of creating instruments to help regulators in developing their activities. So now I'll talk a little bit about what has happened throughout this program. So what is the current situation? Let's start by analyzing the mission, the mandate, the competence and powers, and the scope of regulatory governance. We can note that in this region, normally we have regulators at the national level, and as it happens in Brazil and in Argentina as well, we have regional regulators or state regulators, and we also have intermunicipal and municipal regulators. So this is very specific to Brazil and Argentina and Ecuador, where we can also find some municipal regulators. Regarding regulated activities, a little bit more than 50% of these regulators are specific to water and wastewater services, but we also have other regulators that are in charge of different sectors, so they're the so-called multi-sectoral regulators. We can see that all of the regulators from our sample regulate water supply services. Almost all of them are responsible for wastewater services, but we see that regarding stormwater management, a very small number of regulators is still taking their first steps in this area. We also have here regulators that deal with water resources and others that are responsible for solid waste as well, but not all of them. Now, looking at the territorial domain, we see that most regulators are responsible for regulating urban areas, but there are some regulators that do not have mandate over rural areas and also the neighboring areas to the major urban areas. So this is something that poses major challenges to regulators. We can also see that when it comes to regulated providers, we have some regulators responsible for one service provider, and we also have regulators responsible for regulating thousands of service providers, and that's the extreme case of Peru. And we also see that there is a very different level of maturity when it comes to service provision, and this makes it much harder for regulators to do their job. And in this region, there are also many services, many providers actually, that are trying to reach the universal access to the population. So this is a major challenge. There are also many regulators that are not regulated, and this low level of maturity in urban and peri-urban areas also will impact the regulatory models and regulation. We also have the regulation of informal providers, which is also a challenge. In this case, we need to create rules for these providers. And there is also a tendency for many regulators in this region which are creating different regulations, trying to adapt to the different realities that they find in this area. And they're still trying to find the best criteria to create regulations in this area. Another challenge in the region is accountability and independence. What is the real independence of these regulators? We can see that in most cases, we have independence being recognized by legislation. 83% are independent, but in practice, what happens is that there is a set of aspects in which this independence is not really effective. So it's hard to make it real in practice. And here we need to highlight the importance of the independence of these regulators. We have a very small number of regulators that do not have any sort of political intervention, and we have this figure here representing financial independence, but there are many regulators that are just financed by the government.
So that we can highlight products from Chile. This is where we have public servants who take a test to apply so they can become president of the regulation agency. On the other hand, if we have more, we want to have more independence, we need to have more accountability, and that needs to be fully developed, meaning all accountability mechanisms have to be fully highlighted and reinforced. Now, we need to have the performance better assessed. So we understand those who have good and well-designed benchmarking will end up having better performance. Now, after we have analyzed the governance level and let's look at the regulation and internal assessment. Regulations have several different types of models, and they can be regulatory components. So one of the models is they can be the quality of service, economic performance. So they are organized by type of service provider or knowledge centers term. So there are engineering teams, legal teams, and economists, etc. There are others that structure themselves according to the state, a model like for engineering, water, power, and there are others who structure themselves according to regulatory cycle roles. That means for policy departments and regulation departments, the other for oversight, etc. And thinking about the financial resources, we see several options, and most regulators have followed regulation fees, but there is a major amount of regulators who are funded by the state. There is a lot of variety when we think about human resources. Some regulators have only 5 people under them, for services, for all sorts of services, and there are regulators on the other extreme who have over 700 people working under them. We also, there is a very interesting discussion that is quite ongoing about an office where that houses all resources, or it should be decentralized. That's a question. As well as of tech resources, there is a need for improvement. We see how information is shared and a lot of information that is still very much on paper, on email, and there is a lot of room for growth, for digitalization, for e-processes, and help supporting the teams, the regulators' teams. Now, thinking about how we can contribute to the legislation and the sector regulation. Here we have this pie chart that shows the roles shared when it comes to the components as to how to work and how to support public policies, including better regulation, better legislation. We see several times legislation is not really up to date, and there's a major concern as to simplify and make all processes leaner. This is something that is being discussed as a very important step that must be taken. And regulators should know the legislation so they can actually feel safer. Now, the regulators' contribution for the sector information. There's a lot of room for growth, for improvement. And here we have a pie chart that shows how what the components are, especially as to the need of only asking and requesting information that are strictly required. Sometimes there's an overload of information or people feel overwhelmed, meaning there's a major difference also to the seasonality of reports. There's a different regulators as to how often one regulator asks and requests reports, weekly, monthly, that the frequency should be set as what is the most suitable. Information systems too, how they can help regulatory efficiency. That particular aspect is fundamental, especially when we have several people providing service and everything that pertains process efficiency is incredibly useful to support regulators, and the importance of audits to promote information trustability. Here we have the examples and role model from Brazil with SNIS and the Acertar methodology to fine-tune data, and other actions about data analysis and spread. Now, thinking about training and organizational aspects, now what we notice is a major share, as we can see with the components regarding roles on the pie chart, but the challenges are more in the area of highlighting and reinforcing this government's policy support in policy design and support and monitor and the oversight of this policy's implementation. And how to improve the governance of all providers. The other important information when it comes to legal and contractual regulation is that is very important and is a major challenge in the region to oversee and monitor providers about the life cycle, on their life cycle, and thinking about contract realm, how can we highlight scrutiny and transparency? As for economic regulation, that basically all regulators have, we have several challenges here, like such as improve regulatory accounting improvement, help efficiency efficiency incentives, as well as have leaner methodologies for small service providers. As to service quality levels, what we have noticed is a major trend to regulate according to targets that are set for so that service providers can see what the incentives are and also improve, and very important to improve their quality service assessment and have put more value in benchmarking. As for drinking water quality, it is very important indeed. What we should highlight in this analysis is to improve authority articulation instruments, especially public authorities. It is important, therefore, to have all procedures very well defined because we need to work very quickly due to the fact that it is a public impact matter and of great importance to regulators. Another very important point when we think of regulation is user interface. What we have noticed is most regulators have these levels of concerns, and what we see as a major trend to have regulators more present and communicate in a simpler and more didactic manner what they need to say to users. Here, there's a lot of room for growth to have the effective participation of all these users in the user case concept, proof of concept. I also highlighted other aspects about border as official regulation, and what we see is there is a trend of major concern to improve mechanisms when it comes to monitoring economic accessibility and developing instruments that help focus on subsidies and also environmental regulation oversight to have better environmental resources indicators and to see all the mechanisms that are in place for payment of ecosystem services, meaning introducing tools that enable channeling investments for the recovery of water basins, etc. Now, to conclude, as final takeaways, final major points, the importance to assess, compare, and share experiences that generates very important learning, innovate on the way to on how to regulate. So we need to keep constantly looking at that, and training of all teams and including training of regulators and improve the way that we collaborate, that we cooperate. That means among different institutions in one country, in different organizations and countries, etc. Thank you very much. I also would like to thank all the entities who have taken part in this project. It has been a fantastic experience. Thank you, Rita. Thank you for the overview. Now I want to pass the floor to Oscar Pinto's 10 to 15 minute stops. Oscar Pinto also has a presentation to share. Thank you.
Oscar, pode ligar a câmera, por favor.
Oscar, you can switch on your camera. Thank you.
Tienen que habilitar. No estoy habilitado.
Não, a projeção está boa, mas a câmera...
I'm not being able to, I haven't been able to switch on my camera.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
Ahora sí, ahora se habilitó. Muy buenos
Now,
días,
all good. Good morning.
a todos. Muchas gracias a Aves por la
And
invitación a
thank you very
participar
much
en el panel.
for having me for the invite. I thank for the invite. I will be very brief. I will give you an overview about the Latin America and Caribbean generation landscape. Rita's presentation was absolutely excellent. She gave very clear definitions as to the targets and objectives and how to expand some of them, but it's very similar. My presentation is actually very similar to what we just heard from her, from Rita.
Un segundo.
Clica em cima do slide.
I'm having difficulties to change slides.
Bueno, en primer lugar, quiero comentarles que
Right.
Maderacia,
First and foremost,
la Asociación de América de
I would like to introduce ADERAD. ADERAD is the American Trade Association for Sanitation and Water, and its work is mainly Latin America and the Caribbean region, and we reach over 18 countries. It was created in 2001, and as a consequence of the governance had evolved when it comes to water and sanitation back in the 90s, and since the 90s, therefore, with the new regulation entities, the need to have every country articulating amongst articulators, so they had a experience and communication channel to approach this challenge that we had about the new challenges that we had in our region, and that pertained water and sanitation services. So basically, I would like to show you the institutional evolution in our region. In our case, we can identify 4 major milestones. In a way, they actually mark the different evolution levels that we have witnessed in our industry. Now, in spite of the fact that we have some common elements, that meaning for years but still there are 4 stages that I would like to highlight. The first is the creation of national utility companies. In the beginning of the 20th century, the government's concern was to expand the service, meaning managed to have citizens to access water services and basic sanitation services. For that, we've noticed that our region, and here, I just want to better understand the graph. Here we have individual countries that are not of small geographic size, and the ones with the bigger geographical extension, and federal countries, then they are the federal ones, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. In these cases, we see that in spite of differences, they have created a national company that had the objectives that I mentioned before, meaning to foster the expansion of water and sanitation services to the population. We also identified a well-defined phase, the decentralization phase of major national companies, such as starting transferring the services to subnational administration, meaning state levels or municipal levels. So the decentralization means going state municipal, and that had some variations depending on the country. We identified a chronological order, and a very important element about different evolution phases is the introduction of the service regulation introduction. We will see that further later, because that regards a governance change that took place in the 90s in our region, and showing the Washington Counseling advice, we see several public elements were moved to the private sector. This generated not only a change in the legal framework, but also new regulators. Here we see right at the beginning of the 90s, early 90s. Actually, most followed later, but it's somehow we see regulation being introduced in different countries in the region. And the last element, but not least important, is about the national legislation and how that regulates. And that pertains to three elements. The first is about places where the concession was granted to the private sector to run services. From the year 2000, as a consequence of international crisis and complex scenarios such as investments in our region, since the year 2000, we see a lot of service providers moving to the private sector. And necessarily, there's been a reformulation of the entire sector. In some cases, it was prior, and it was connected to service concession and transformation. And in some cases and in some countries, it was possible to continue, and in some others are still pending. In the case of 2007, in the case of Brazil, we see a major transformation, and in 2020, legislation change with due to the legislature changes. Here we're speaking of Argentina. They created a national public-run company in 1992, but there was a decentralization in 1981, but the first company was 1912. But now, because it is a federal type of country, we don't have a national regulation and standards for the entire country. So it's not easy to implement anything because every state owns their own resources and equipment. So now they are working on national legislation that can align all interests and regulations and systems, so that there is a national designed, federal design plan for sanitation. Just as a quick comment, in Argentina, we have two common aspects, which is water regulation aspects and water treatment. So especially coming from water coming from surfaces, especially when we think state-wise.
Well, that being said, I want to mention something that we were saying at the beginning. In the 90s, we had the incorporation of the private sector to provide these services. And because of that, we need to change some regulatory frameworks. And in this way, we had to import new models to regulate the private sector. From 1906 to 2006, we had the emergence of 200 new regulators, infrastructure regulators, not only for water and sanitation, but also for other services. And this has created many different problems because we have incorporated the European model into our region, but there were major regions regarding access, regarding quality of services, especially something that is very important, data availability. So at the time, it was very hard to identify data when our regulatory framework was changed. And compared to Europe, there were some differences regarding human resources and the technical capacity of providers. And there was also a difference in governance. There's another thing that we need to note here. So far, economic regulation has been expanding. Starting in 2010, the definition of water services or access to water services as a human right has led governments upon which the United Nations puts the responsibility of guaranteeing access to water, this has led to larger economic regulations. And because of all of this new responsibility, now governments are trying to give access, universal access to the whole of the population, making sure that they can access the benefits of these services. In general, we can say, as Rita mentioned, that access can happen in many different ways through independent regulatory agencies, national agencies, municipal agencies. And another important aspect is that we can have self-regulation as well. This is something that happens normally at the municipal level. In Latin America, there is a major array of schemes of provision and regulation of this service, which makes it hard for us to get to a conclusion, considering that regulatory characteristics depend on the governance of each country. Each country has their own legislation with their own political criteria and geographical criteria. And because of that, as previously mentioned, there is a great variety of regulators. Many of them have a lot of human resources regulating operators, and whereas others have a small team regulating a lot of agencies. So there is a major difference here when it comes to governance and also regulatory aspects. The regulation of services, regarding what I mentioned, there are two countries where they have two very well-defined regulators at the state level and municipal levels, and the rest of the region has a national regulator. Access to water and wastewater services is a human right, and 4 countries have already incorporated this in their constitution. Some other countries have that not in their constitution but as part of their jurisdiction. There are 2 countries, Chile and Panama, that do not consider water and wastewater services a human right. Just the only thing they take into consideration is what was presented by the United Nations. It's not part of their legislation. Within Latin America and the Caribbean, there are 4 countries where the services cannot be capped from the population due to lack of payment. Subsidies have also to do with social aspects of the service and also the economic situation of countries. There is a lot of different subsidies that happen in this service. We have the so-called cross subsidies, and we also have other subsidies based on supply and others demand-based subsidies, and that includes demands for users, the social aspects and infrastructure aspects, and many times this is related to coverage. Service coverage and extension of service coverage is something that affects some places, especially more underserved areas, and that's where major problems are, and that the problems that need to be addressed. Many times we do not have really the creation of infrastructure that is necessary for the population to access this service. In some cases, we need to include subsidies to help users reach and have access to these services. There are also problems, of course, in regulations involving government and other regulators. There are major trends and challenges. One of the major challenges is the great diversity and institutional architecture of this sector. We need to learn case by case so that we can adapt solutions. In the region, we also have a problem with service provision. We we have a great problem
no alcanza todo
because the number of services of the number of regulators, many times they are not able to cover the whole country or the whole region. And at the same time, these regulations many times are not mature enough to deal with urban areas and also very urban areas in many countries, such as in Peru, where there are many
también operadores en áreas rurales.
regulated operators.
Lo último, y acá también América Latina es un fenómeno muy claro y a partir de
The regulators are also responsible for regulation in urban areas. And last, since the 2000s, we have seen that now many companies, many private companies, have become state-owned companies. And this shows that the system has changed. And with state-owned companies, targets are different. There are public operators which have to adapt to governments. So this is completely different from what happens with the private sector. We know that the incentives for private companies is different from public companies. Regarding challenges for regulators, we have legislation as a major problem. We also need to have greater independence. This is something that is very important as well. And the regulation of major providers is also very hard. The creation of private entities is something that is very important here. Well, we have to learn some lessons from everything that we have been doing. So far, we know that there is no universal model. Each country and each region needs to have their own model according to their own context. We need to guarantee the sustainability of service and have a holistic approach. Regulators not only need to enforce regulation, but they also need to have a broader view to allow them to have a greater assessment, detecting potential risks when providing services. Finally, they need to promote technological innovations, the technological innovation of processes. Processes need to be scalable and applicable according to the potential of each system. We need to make sure that we are constantly promoting the creation of technology. And finally, we need to make sure that we are constantly promoting the human right to access water. And as regulator and as government, we are responsible for guaranteeing this human right. And we believe that regulators need to contribute towards this. Well, I apologize if I ran over time. Thank you so much. Now I will pass the floor immediately to Julio Aguilera. Julio, please. You have 10 to 12 minutes, 15 max, for you to share your presentation with us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jaime. Thank you for the opportunity to be here talking a little bit about some reflections on the regulation in Latin America, and also talk about the context of our regulations and how it plays a part in our public policies and our legal framework. I don't want to repeat what Oscar and Rita have said before, but the state of art of the regulation in Latin America and the Latin America regulations is something important. But today, I want to focus on some problems that we have for regulators, the challenges that they have, and how this can create even more challenges for regional regulators in Latin America. First of all, we need to understand there are stages of maturity, both for governments and regulatory entities. And these stages of maturity are related to the evolution of institutional infrastructure. There are many regulators that are still starting their process. They're in the first stage of maturity, and it's important for us to recognize that many times these regulators don't understand their own role, and many times governments and users don't understand the role of these regulators. And this requires a series of actions to make sure that we understand the role of these regulators. There's also the absence of regulatory governments, which is also a problem. We need to understand decision-making mechanisms, and we need to adapt also that idea of corporate government. The government itself and its institutional structure can adopt corporate governance structures. So for the way companies also make decisions, these are things that we can learn from corporate governance, because this strengthens this process and it makes it more transparent. A third point that we have identified is that in many cases there are regulators that are responsible for just one or two services, but that do not know anything about wastewater management or urban drainage. And this can affect external aspects which will affect provision of these services. So it's important to analyze to what extent these problems can create a divergence in the provision of these services. Rita and Oscar have also touched upon the problem or the need to have a different regulation for each region, or having a regulation for rural areas given the characteristics of this area and given the technology available to these areas, which are different from what we have in urban areas. So that's why it's important for us to create regulatory frameworks adapted to different realities. We see that the legal framework for major service providers can lead to interpretation problems, and that's why this is a challenge for the future that we need to address.
¿Me confirman?
Sí, está buena ahora. Bueno.
¿Ahora sí?
Sí.
Muchas gracias, Jaime, por la aclaración. Entonces, un primer desafío derivado de estos problemas que he tratado de mostrar. Lo primero es consolidar.
Well, a first challenge resulting from these problems is, the first one is consolidate an information system. This is crucial. We need to have a regulatory information system which will allow regulators to make decisions, and this information needs to be timely and relevant. This information system at the same time needs to build information based on value. We see that many times, given the effort to create information, regulators and other state entities end up missing information. Or in many cases, information does not build value. Sometimes we do not use information the way it needs to be used. So a regulatory information system would be important to build value and to create additional value to those that need information. This implies that we necessarily need to think of a centralized system, a system that will allow for us to reduce costs, transaction costs for the sector. In this case, regulators can play an essential role. They can, for example, manage information and somehow transform them and translate them into the information necessary for the sector. Maybe we can have the participation of the academia, of different sectors. The system needs to be also interoperable. It's important for the regulatory information system to be connected to other associated systems, for example, related to environmental management or other systems, for example, related to land organization or a unified registry. So we need this interoperability because this will give us the necessary synergy to reduce transaction costs. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is implementing regulatory accounting. Regulatory accounting is not only about accounting per se. As I mentioned before, we need to look at the stages of maturity. We need to see what's the level of maturity of the regulator compared to the state of the art, compared to where we want this regulator to go. I'm sure that during these first phases of regulation, you need to have regulatory accounting for you to determine and set tariffs. So accounting is fundamental for us to determine tariff tiers, for example. So in this first phase, we need to establish a regulatory accounting. So that means that we need to understand what will be taken into account to set tariffs, for example. Afterwards, we can have regulatory accounting becoming an input to help us understand and our tariffs as well. So first, we can have regulatory accounting helping us set tariffs, but then afterwards we can include other aspects as well. For example, level of water losses. This does not have to do with revenue water per se. It has to do with an economic problem, which is related to costs and also other aspects. And it has to do with the cost of the system as a whole. The whole idea here is for us to feed regulatory accounting with these other aspects so that we can have more robust regulatory frameworks. Regulatory accounting will help us also fulfill our tariff contract. That means that when we are setting tariffs, we are creating a contract with our users. And it has to do with quality, continuity, and provision of these services. Tariffs are instruments that reflect an obligation between providers and users. Providers need to deliver a service in certain conditions, and all of that is implicit into the tariff. When we think about accounting, we need to progressively improve so that we can reach a stage in our regulation where we can define and regulate things with the necessary plans that will help us fulfill our goals regarding coverage and quality and others. The third challenge that we have is implementing impact. Having a regulatory impact assessment. OECD says that bad regulation can impose unnecessary costs to our society, and it can prevent us from innovating and also can keep us from creating more competition. When we're talking about regulation, we're not talking about just creating a number of regulations without analyzing the consequences of these regulations. We know that regulatory frameworks need to be minimum, meaning that we need to have just the necessary standards that will not keep us from having the participation of other sectors as well. We need regulations that will not keep us from creating innovations and from improving management processes. And of course, that this can also limit and impact costs, because this will definitely impact costs. If we do not have regulatory impact assessment, we might be just keeping the country from creating the right infrastructure. And that's why we need to analyze these standards thoroughly. And what are the alternatives that we have here? Well, we are talking here not about creating regulations just for the sake of creating regulations. They need to have an objective, and we need to analyze the impacts that we will generate with these standards that are being created. And of course, there's a methodology for us to analyze impacts and analyze other benefits and etc. The third important element is monitoring regulatory decisions. We're not just talking here about creating regulations, but also monitoring them. So once these regulations are implemented, we need to assess if they are in line with the objectives they were created for. For example, you might have a standard that was created, you might have a regulatory framework that requires this standard, but afterwards you might not have an assessment to assess if the standard was has played the role it was created for. A fourth challenge that we have when we think about the future of regulators is how regulation will help us fulfill 2030 our 2030 agenda and the SDGs. How can we reach these SDGs through our tariffs, and how can through our regulation be aligned with SDGs? And when I talk about tariffs, I'm not just talking about cost, the cost of services. I'm also talking about other elements. So we need to understand what are the incentives regulators are creating so that new companies enter into the market. Or the opposite, what are the barriers being created for the expansion of the sector? So all of these elements are related to tariffs, to our tariff pattern and regime. So what are we doing to align our tariffs with the fulfillment of our 2030 agenda? Second, how can we implement sustainable tariff system and also social tariffs? It's very clear that CAPEX needs the needs for investment to fulfill 2030 the 2030 agenda. It would lead to create the creation of ever-growing tariffs. So maybe we don't have the investments that we need to achieve the SDGs now. So how can we have a sustainable system, and at the same time, how can we find a way to reflect this on our tariffs? And of course, that after the pandemic, we know that the problems that have arisen will affect our tariffs. So how do we deal with that?
Meaning having social tariffs. And also, what really matters is to understand that the regulator issue, it means sustainable tariffs, meaning they have to fulfill social care criteria. But the redistribution of this weight, the funding weight, has been a tax issue, meaning the state is actually paying the rest of the bill. So we have accountability of all the sources that have been feeding the capex and investment in the sector, because in this way we can understand the sources municipally, state level, and according to departments, whatever it is, depending on the country, meaning we need to put together resources, analyze accounting thoroughly, see who funds what, so we can actually understand how much we need. And when we know how much we need, we don't even need, then we implement new innovative mechanisms for funding. So we need to ultimately diminish the need of federal taxes to cover inefficiencies or deficiencies, actually. And when it comes to deficiency investment goals for the entire service providing. So we need to grade companies as companies set grow, they can have funding that is based on results. It's also important to show that we, in the Latin American countries, like cases like Chile, Brazil, and Colombia, Colombia has actually been working on this, and we see this taking place. So they have second opinion. They also have bonus framework, and very soon they will shall be issuing green bonds. These instruments were completely outside the industry, so it's very important to have this introduction, this inclusion of new targets of global development goals, objectives, GDOs, and we also have systems that include mixed systems, meaning resources that include concessions and other entities that actually can deliver what the sector needs. So the idea is to have a mixed structure so that companies can have access to this type of mechanism. So this is it from me, from my side. I thank you for your attention,
Muito obrigado.
and I would like to pass the floor
Uma excelente
back
introdução
to Jamis. Thank you so much for your intervention. Thank you so much
do fim.
from your words.
Até o máximo de
Irene Altafim, now we'll hear from you.
PowerPoint.
We will have no longer than 15 minutes, so let's hear from you. Please share your PowerPoint.
Vocês me veem?
Okay, thank you.
É necessário pôr em tela cheia?
Do you need to do full screen? I am on full screen.
Aqui me parece já em tela cheia.
For me, it's showing as full screen. Just 1 second.
Sim?
Now, yes? No.
Para mim ela está em tela cheia já. Um momento.
Irene, você precisa parar o seu compartilhamento e compartilhar de novo em tela cheia. Em vez de escolher o PowerPoint, escolhe Screen, a opção.
Tá. Interessante que para mim ela já está em tela cheia. Realmente no teste ela entrou e agora ela não está entrando. Talvez vai ter que ser assim, desculpa. Não sei como é que nós vamos fazer. Desculpa, vou sair novamente.
Sair e entrar, sim.
Deixa eu sair, peraí. Então, share. Estão vendo, não?
Vamos ao mesmo. Devia tirar a partilha e voltar a partilhar. Isso, e agora volta a partilhar.
Vou colocar novamente. Share screen. Share.
E agora, tela cheia? Não. Não está dando. O melhor é fazer assim mesmo. Então.
Ela está, infelizmente, ela está aqui para mim aparecendo tela cheia. Eu peço 1000 desculpas.
Não, apresenta assim mesmo.
Vou tentar mais uma vez tela cheia. Ela está aparecendo como se tivesse tela cheia. Pena. Peço muitas desculpas aos senhores. Boa tarde, bom dia a todos. Obrigada pela.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to be here. One of the main advantages of an event like this is to have context of background, because we always see ourselves in the center of problems and in isolation. So when we hear a presentation by Oscar or by Rita, we actually get together and we see issues that are commonplace, and we also can think of solutions that are commonplace that actually can get to objectives for the entire Latin America. So why does this sanitation industry needs a new legal framework? Going back to Oscar and the 90s catastrophe with incentives to have private investment participation with no clear policies pertaining regulations, oversight, and service providing, well articulated to meet the demands of service universalization. So, from this rationale, we see this happening only in 2007. And what have we learned? That we can see Latin America in a broader sense and notice that the pursuit for universalization is a secular pursuit that goes through different stages. We've seen private capital with investment with no regulation whatsoever, then a lesson of lessons learned where countries developed policies separating roles, and now we are actually in a third wave, I would say, where these policies are being reassessed. And this is exactly what has taken place in Brazil after 12 years of the first uh, sanitation framework milestone. This one brought a lot of uh, advancement when it comes to role separation. But these kind of headway has not been enough to reach the universalization goal. The coverage and efficiency of services, investments that are that are not enough, and inefficiency of expenditure, as well as non-compliant regulation, compliable regulation. So since the 447 piece of legislation, what we have seen better conception and milestone from the existing milestone and equating very important points with the objective to power up to maximize the pathway to the service universalization. So we can see in the new legal framework four axes: regulatory harmonization, governance improvement, and that includes a regulation and standards set by the one entity that clearly states rules in existing and new contracts, at investment attractive components so that universalization can be reached, as well scale up promotion so that new savings can be achieved. All these targets are very ambitious for the entire country, especially in a country where sanitation and sewage is automated. That means the collection only reaches 13% of the population, and the target is to get to 90%. When it comes to water supply, we see a major deficit too. So in order to reach these targets, it requires articulation amongst all axes in our policies. Now, moving on to specifically to the sanitation industry regulation. Since the approval of the legislation 11445, the risks of having this sector regulated and the issues had already been identified. What are the risks identified? First, is very politically very sensitive, very much subject to political climate, as well as information asymmetry. With the new milestone and framework that has been addressed, as well as legal uncertainty, low technical capacity, scarcity of power and agencies, and the new legislation is trying to address these issues. So now the landscape confirms all the liabilities and risks and actually makes them even more severe. So the 2020, we see over 80 regulator agencies with different typologies, sizes, with different levels of maturity too. Low coverage in spite of is also for water and sewage regulation, 11,000, over 1,000 municipalities with low coverage and no regulation. And now the framework is considering the four axes: water treatment, urban drainage, solid waste treatment, and what everything that is considered service means to actually means universalization. Now, we also have non-regulated rural sanitation, and that has been identified and mentioned and very well covered by Oscar. And here is the aspect the social aspect. The peri-urban and rural areas have spent most of the time in the past years outside service and regulation. So that means low governance in a nutshell. Now, several Latin American countries are suffering the same issues, which is to reach universalization. The new arrangement proposed by the new legal framework and thinking about the new regulation aspects like fragmentation regulation, what has been said is to allocate accountability, and that's when Anna comes to play. It issues new standards and regular guidance, and that as a process of that includes voluntary adhesion, but helps to have public pay from the federal government to other realms of the government so that here the other action that is together and as a consequence is to foster adhesion to the standards due to pressure from international agencies. Also, technical studies not only to support standards but also to help policy implementation, promote the training of regulating agencies, also regulate arbitrage and mediation, and also communicate the benchmark standards so that it can all be done and verified. Very well. Now, I am going to move on to the major challenges about our compliancy and sanitation and what we see. First, national guidelines for infranational entities where T0 is not. Let's start new agencies. No, we have agencies with over 12 years experience, very well consolidated with their own standards, very well structured. So how to turn, how to move this with new standards and complement new standards. So how to harmonize all this? This is a major challenge. The second is national guidelines for the type different agencies structures. The level of maturity are all very distinct. I'm gonna give an example. A solid waste treatment guideline that needs to be fulfilled for next year that exists and the owner is connected to an international agency, there is a requirement of international involvement. So what we're talking about is a context, a background that lacks uniformity, where consolidated agencies that regulate water, sewage, and waste treatment and drainage, they have to live with recently created agencies have no means to regulate the water and waste. The other challenge is the coexistence of regulation models. The new legal framework says that the new contracts are regulated from a discretionary regulation. They're not renewable, but we have contracts until 2083, and they're still in term. They're still valid, and the contingency is a major contingency of municipalities with self-regulation models. So, what general guidelines can be applied in a context that is so unequal and so with so many model regulations and distinct regulation models? The other point is how to monitor the regulations, the regulatory agency performance. How far can they reach? What is actually their role? How can we oversee the regulatory agency? How can we have proof and evidence? Because the agency can issue a new standard that refers to a national policy, because it is not up to the water national agencies to actually set regulation rules. So how can one monitor this entire universe? This is a major challenge. The other point is, once we have challenges, all other strategies to overcome this extensive regulatory agency, what we see the strategy is first, regulatory agency. The issue is to set up standards and guidance in a context that thinks about the regulatory impact. So the process of elaborating a new standard takes up to 9 to 10 months, because the first stage is to design the impact. Then once you have a standard, and then assess the regulatory results. So this is a long process that requires a lot of study and even the assessment to say what is the regulatory issue, what pathway will be taken, what are the alternatives, what are the risks. The well implemented regulatory agenda is not just standard elaboration, but to place in the same context. You only have 2 minutes, Irene. A second point that I find fundamental is active listening. When it comes to decision making, it includes listening service providers, private and public, or mixed kind of international, national trade associations, all of that, all stakeholders need to be heard, because that helps and bases the new benchmark standardization. So sometimes we have 20, 30 meetings with small groups, sometimes with bigger groups, always thinking about the methodology because it's a regulation agency. So this strategy is fundamental, because we have to consider the diversity and articulation. An articulation that is not only institutional and federal, so that we are also one of the agencies that implement a policy, but also a very important aspect is to articulate with other regulation dimensions like ANA. It is a national water and sanitation agency. If it's going to give a permit, we need to see if this service provider is regulated. If that request for water and sewage treatment, if that process is actually in compliance with the framework. So the integration among policies is fundamental. So these are the 4 pillars where our strategy is supported by, so that we can reach to a regulatory harmony stage. The challenge is major. It is not easy. We are starting from scratch, and we count on the participation to help. So thank you very much. And once again, I apologize for not being able to share my screen properly. Thank you, Irene, for the excellent presentation to what the strategy is. Now, our time is nearly up. Now I'm going to ask Cynthia Vilarinho to try and very briefly summarize the questions that have been submitted on the chat. So we have the opportunity to do a last round of questions and answers. Cynthia? Hi, we got several questions that I would like to thank all who have submitted the questions. And like we said, I'm going to summarize some questions so we can address some of the topics. So the first one is a question by Luis Tando to Rita Amaral. that is about the regulation, an overview of the regulation in Latin America. So the question is it possible to assess the maturity level and the advancements in Latin America and compare to other regions in the world? He mentions the US and Europe, and in the same line of thinking, question up to Oscar. If he can answer about the need to adapt the regulatory models, like he said in his presentation, so that we don't take the risks of imports regulations from different contexts when we think, especially when we think of Brazil and Latin America. Brazil is one of the countries that implemented regulation recently, and how these adaptations and benchmarking can be used here in Brazil. So Rita, please feel free to do so. Cynthia, maybe our time is nearly up, so maybe we should. This is the first block of questions. The second, there is a question by Álvaro José, who is asking why regionalization is considered a great, an optimal model. With the financial and technical ability, why should they adopt this regionalization model? So, Julia Aguilera and Renato Afin, would you please comment on the regionalization topic? Then, we also have a question from Carlos Alberto Rosito, and he's asking, does it make sense to regulate regulation? Thinking about the Brazilian model, where ANA is the national regulator, like Irena Tafin presented, that shows the benchmark and guidance to all regulators. So how can that work? What is the best practice? And we should also observe Luciano Acep's big question on the same note. What are the main challenges in educating national standards, thinking about the regional peculiarities? So this block speaking about the sense of regulation, I think it would be interesting to hear from Irene Tafin, Ana, and Oscar Finto's view and the experience, and it would be interesting to hear from the Argentinian experience. One more block? Yes, please. And one more block of questions about different regulation means, thinking about the size of the service providers, what kind of application, urban, rural application. So this question is addressed to Rita Amaral about the results that you've been observing at Liz Wilson in Latin America. And specifically for Julia Aguilera, there is a question looking at a Brazilian case where recent concession included villas with 200 to 1,000 people, and these users will pay the same tariffs, the same as if they lived in the capital or city or in smaller municipalities. What would be the recommendation? What is the same regulation modeling to regulate tariffs, thinking about the needs of a different regulation according to location? Suelen, we have a good set of questions. We have very little time. So, Rita, Oscar, and Irene, let's try and be brief in the answers. Rita?
Obrigada, Cíntia. Obrigada a todos pelas questões. Sobre a primeira, e obrigada, Luís, pela questão, sobre o nível de maturidade da regulação na região, daquilo que temos vindo, primeiro há um ponto importante que é esta variabilidade dentro da região. Portanto, quando estamos a comparar com outros, nós temos uns que estão, pelo que vemos, que são reguladores muito bons.
When we compare with others, we see that there are some that are very good. So regions where we have concessions, we have a lot of instruments and regulatory instruments that are very well developed within the region. And we also have very innovative mechanisms, but we also have other regulators that are still incipient and that have a very low level of maturity. Regarding challenges, I would say that to implement and to have successful regulations, just a good regulator is not enough. There is another set of aspects that are important for us to succeed. And here I'm talking about institutionality and institutional architecture, and also the aspects of organization of the market structure. So we need to have a good regulation for millions of operators. So there are here other external aspects that affect this regulation. And regarding the second question, which is more focused on results in rural urban spaces, here we find a lot of different challenges regarding the characteristics of occupation of these spaces. When we're talking about rural areas and when we're talking about places where we have low density population, these areas and regions are normally hard to access, and information collection is also a problem because in many of these areas we do not have internet access, so this creates additional challenges to regulators. There is also a very high fragmentation of providers in these areas. The types of technologies are very different as well in this area, and this has also to do with the low payment capacity or ability to pay of these populations, and this is also a special challenge that we have for regulation. Thank you, Rita. Now, Oscar, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes. You're on mute, Oscar.
Bueno, trataré de ser muy sintético.
Thank you, Jaime. Well, I'll try to be brief. I've written down the questions here, and there are 3 points regarding the first question, which is regarding the importing models. We know that the origin of regulatory models in our region is something that came based on a macroeconomic decision made in our countries as a consequence of the precepts of the Washington Consensus. So it was not a consequence of the maturity of the system of the wastewater sanitation system, but it was actually a measure somehow imposed because of the international crisis that there was in the 80s. The Washington Council has created national transformations, and among them reducing concessions in the public sector and moving on to the private sector. And this was a consequence of our fiscal deficit. And according to the context of each country, there was an imposition of a model of a new governance. And this happens many years ago. There is a lot of history since then and a whole context that has led us to where we are now. And now that's why it's important for us to start creating our own models. And that's why I mentioned that the regulation needs to be adapted to the context of each country. In this sense, regulation is another piece of the governance cog, where we include governments, regulators, government entities, and service providers, and also another important element, which are users. So we need to involve many different aspects when it comes to regulation. We normally say that we need to create our own path as we advance. In Latin America, we have our different models. Every country has evolved in a different way, and I think that we are advancing now. Now we will no longer import models. Now we need to adapt our regulation according to what we already know in our region. Regarding the regulatory aspect, Argentina and Brazil are federative countries with similar characteristics, and Brazil is ahead of Argentina since in Argentina we don't have the same legislation. We are working on this, but we clearly see that there is a fight, if you will, between those that have the capacity to pay, really, but we know that governments have the capacity to pay, but provinces are responsible for the service. So this is a very tense situation. The federal government will have to make resources available and distribute them countrywide, and the provinces and municipalities will need to use these subsidies in line with what is required of them. We are trying to find a win-win situation. Each party will contribute somehow and win somehow in countries, and in these countries the states are the ones that have the faculties and that have the responsibility. So if the federal government has imposed some demands, they will also have to give and allocate resources towards that. This is a fundamental element, but there is another important challenge that needs to be addressed here. Regulation is not only about it's not only enforcing the regulatory framework and guaranteeing the quality of service, but regulators also need to have specific regulations. We cannot treat major companies that have human resource capacity to implement everything that is asked of them the same way we treat smaller companies, rural companies, for example, in which regulators will not only try to enforce the framework. The federal government needs to help these companies improve their system as a whole. We, as regulators, have to cooperate and contribute so that these small service providers can also improve their services. Next speaker, 5 minutes. Thank you, Jaime. I'll try to summarize and bring both questions that were asked together. One thing is when we talk about regionalization, and another thing is when we talk about concessions. When we talk about regionalization, it's fundamental that we advance. We need to have a smaller number of providers, and this is not an end in itself. This is just a means for us to become more efficient. In our case, in Colombia, we have around 25,000 service providers, and that taking into account rural providers, and it's very hard for our regulator to deal with that. In many cases, the same thing happens, but this makes us have an entity responsible for surveillance and control, regulating 25,000 providers, and this doesn't make sense. So we should have regionalization not as an end in itself, but as a means to reap benefits. And what benefits? Well, when you have fewer companies, it's easier for you to regulate, and it's easier for you to enforce public policies, just because this way our resources will be better allocated, and this way companies will have more resources to implement. So when we have fewer companies, that is much easier. And we need to think about economies of scale. As we start regionalizing things, we will have costs that are centralized, and we will have a single brain, if you will, in charge of preventive maintenance and operations. So with economies of scale, we have lower tariffs to users as well. So once again, we're talking about a win-win situation. Companies will benefit from saving costs, and users will pay less. I know a company, for example, that manages different markets, and this leads to a lot of benefits. And this is a benefit that we can also have with regionalization. So this is not just a matter of having fewer companies, but it's about bundling up these companies and having more benefits, which are, of course, benefits that need to be measured. So I would point to a public policy that will regionalize mechanisms, and we'll also create a regulatory instrument. I'm not just talking here about impacting tariffs, I'm also talking about the unification of markets and bringing companies together. So regulators can have a very relevant advantage when it comes to regionalization. Now, regarding the second question related to concession, there is not a universally optimal regulatory model that will guarantee the best results based on this model. There is actually a series of combinations that you can have. For example, that are models where you have public-private partnerships, and this can be a great model for certain types of populations, considering that their market characteristics will allow companies to execute their actions based on very clear elements that are contractually already agreed. And as you move on the milestones in the contracts, you can advance, and this can work, for example, in certain markets, or you can have another combination of mechanisms. For example, you can have a tariff regulation, and you can have other models inside of municipalities according to markets that, given their characteristics, can have public-private partnerships as well. So maybe this can become very efficient in some areas, but this will depend on the context. And just to finalize on this, both regionalization and concession are just two faces of the same coin, really. What we are looking for here is better quality service, but these two mechanisms might be the answer to our problems. You can combine them, and you can also use them separately, making sure that you be as efficient as you're trying to be. Thank you. Irene? You have 5 minutes, please. Julio has already talked about regionalization, and I know that regionalization is not the only answer, and it's not something new either. If we think about Planesa's strategy, it was a regionalization strategy where the state would be the region, but after a while we've had some problems with that. But we also have the experience of municipalities that have reached universal access, but considering the major deficits that we have and considering the major challenge that we have to try and reach universal access in the midterm and record time, regionalization has proven to be the best methodology. That's the first point. The second point is the regulation of the regulation. That's not what Ana is doing. We're not regulating the regulation, but we need to assess what has happened after 10 years of the 11445 legislation in terms of regulation. Many times service providers with 2 and 3 regulatory agencies with different standards and different indicators were, of course, harmed by this. That's the first thing we need to take into consideration. Second, we need to look at maturity and legal certainty. We need to look at the maturity of regulatory agencies. And what Ana wants to do and what is part of the legal framework is the creation of standards, of reference standards for international agencies to adopt. The third question was regarding challenges. Yes, it is a major challenge considering the heterogeneity and also the size of our country and the different types of regulatory agencies that we have. It's hard for us to find a single norm that will serve everyone's purpose. So a big challenge is for us to take into consideration the specific characteristics based on the different types of agencies in such a way that our reference standards will contribute and not create any kind of regulatory impasse. But let's remember, we're talking here about reference standards, and one of the points that I highlighted on my last slide is that our goal is to have simple, effective, and gradual changes. Thank you. Thank you, Irene.
Já uma volta por todos os oradores, procurando responder às perguntas.
Well, we've already had a round of answers, and given the time, I will just speak for 2 more minutes just to make sure you know that this video will be available on our channel on YouTube. You can also go to our website to see the agenda for our special sessions. This was just the first one of many. Tomorrow there will be a special webinar, as I said before. And on Tuesday we will have another special session. And remember that you can register to participate in these events free of charge. And we will have from May 23rd to May 27th the Brazil Water Week. Remember that it will be streamed online through an interactive and exclusive platform with over 100 speakers from Brazil and from other countries in the world. Make sure that you register to participate in this major event as well. There's another event, which is the 20th Luso-Brazilian Symposium on Sustainability in Water and Challenges and Actions. It will be taking place from June 29th to July 1st. You can also find more information on our website, which whose address can be found in the chat box. So I want to make sure that you can all take part in all the activities that we will be carrying out. I just want to wrap up by thank you all for being here. I want to thank also for the invitation. I want to thank Rita, Oscar, Julio, and Irene for your excellent presentations. I also want to thank Cynthia, who has been an excellent moderator, and I also want to thank all the participants who attended our session today. Thank you so much, and now we've reached the end of this.